Sight lies, scent doesn't. That was the first thing anyone learned about Alpha King Cassian Vale. Blinded in the border wars that made him king, ruler of a territory that had long since stopped whispering about his missing sight, and started whispering instead about how much more dangerous he'd become without it. Every alpha at the choosing ceremony that year looked straight through Sage Calloway, the smallest, plainest Omega in the room. Cassian never looked at her at all. He didn't need to. The moment she stepped onto the platform, he stopped breathing normally for the first time in 3 years, and every wolf in the hall understood, all at once, that the king had just found something none of them had ever bothered to see. Before the next part begins, hit like and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your comment might inspire someone else to join us. Let's continue. Sage Calloway had learned, over 19 years of careful, deliberate smallness, exactly how invisible a person could make herself if she practiced hard enough. It wasn't difficult, honestly. Being invisible was less a skill than a natural consequence of being exactly what everyone expected an unremarkable Omega to be. Narrow-shouldered, quiet-voiced, the kind of plain that didn't inspire cruelty so much as simple, thorough disregard. In Ashgrove Pack, where beauty and rank determined nearly everything, Sage had spent her whole life understanding herself as a footnote in a story that belonged to other people. Tonight, standing at the edge of the choosing grounds in a borrowed grey dress that hung loose on her thin frame, Sage watched the ceremony unfold exactly the way it always did. Golden torches strung between ancient oaks, laughter bright and expectant, every unmated wolf in the territory dressed in their finest and praying an alpha's gaze would land on them and change everything. She wasn't praying for that. She'd stopped believing in that particular kind of miracle years ago. You could at least pretend to hope, said Della, the only wolf in Ashgrove who still bothered speaking to Sage with any real warmth. Della's family ranked only slightly higher than Sage's own, low enough to understand exactly how it felt to stand at these ceremonies and watch better-connected wolves get chosen first, year after year. It doesn't cost anything to hope, Sage. It costs plenty, when nothing ever comes of it, Sage said, though she said it gently, without bitterness, because bitterness required energy she'd learned not to waste on things she couldn't change. Word had spread through the crowd an hour earlier, restless and electric, that Ashgrove's own Alpha King was in attendance tonight, a rare event, since Cassian Vale rarely left his private territory for another pack's ceremonies, preferring instead to send emissaries who reported back on which wolves might make suitable matches for allied packs. But apparently, this year was different. Apparently the king himself had traveled 3 days specifically to attend Ashgrove's choosing. Sage understood, distantly, that this should have mattered to her the way it seemed to matter to everyone else in the crowd. Wolves preening and repositioning themselves hopefully near the front of the gathering, in case the king's attention happened to land their way. But Cassian Vale was, by every account Sage had ever heard, the most powerful alpha in 3 territories, blinded 3 years ago in a border skirmish that had nearly cost him his life, and had, according to every rumor that followed him since, made him more dangerous rather than less. An alpha like that would never choose an Omega like her. The math had never once worked out differently, no matter which alpha stood at the center of a given ceremony. Sage Calloway, the ceremony's officiant, called, and Sage felt the familiar cold drop in her stomach that came every single year at the sound of her own name, the humiliating ritual of walking to the platform knowing, with absolute certainty, exactly how this would end. She climbed the steps on legs that had long since stopped shaking from nerves and started merely aching from the effort of pretending this didn't hurt. She stood in the designated spot, eyes fixed somewhere just past the crowd, and waited out the familiar silence that always followed her name, the particular, humiliating quiet of dozens of alphas deciding, collectively and without discussion, that she wasn't worth the trouble of claiming. She counted heartbeats, the way she always did, 1, 5, 10. And then, from the back of the gathering, near the section reserved for visiting dignitaries, a chair scraped hard against stone. Sage's eyes snapped toward the sound before she could stop herself, and found the entire crowd already turning too, murmurs rippling outward as Alpha King Cassian Vale rose from his seat, his expression unreadable, behind eyes the color of storm clouds that saw nothing at all anymore, and yet somehow seemed, in that moment, more fixed on her than any sighted gaze had ever managed to be. He crossed the space between his seat and the platform, with the sure, deliberate steps of a man who'd long since learned to navigate a world he could no longer see, his warriors instinctively clearing a path around him without needing to be asked. Sage watched him approach with a growing, disbelieving confusion, certain there had to be some mistake, some other reason entirely for the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories to be walking directly toward the platform where the least remarkable wolf in Ashgrove stood waiting to be overlooked, exactly as she always was. He stopped at the base of the steps and lifted his face slightly, drawing in a slow, deliberate breath. "Say something," Cassian said, his voice low and rough, carrying easily through the stunned silence of the entire gathering. "Anything, I need to hear your voice." Sage's own voice came out barely above a whisper, disbelief and confusion tangled together in equal measure. "I don't understand what's happening." Cassian's expression shifted, something that might have been the beginning of a smile, or wonder, or both. "I'm not sure I do either," he admitted, "but I've never smelled anything like you in my entire life, and I intend to find out exactly why." The entire hall fell into stunned, disbelieving silence, and Sage stood frozen at the top of the platform, wondering whether the world had simply broken, or whether, impossibly, after 19 years of being invisible, someone had finally found a way to see her that had nothing to do with sight at all. The choosing grounds erupted into chaos the moment Cassian's words settled over the crowd, whispers exploding into open, disbelieving conversation on every side. "The blind king chose the invisible girl," someone murmured, loud enough to carry. "Of all the wolves in this territory, that's Sage Calloway. She's nobody. Her family barely ranks at all." Sage stood frozen at the top of the platform, every instinct she owned screaming at her to run, to disappear the way she always did the moment attention landed on her uninvited. But Cassian remained exactly where he stood at the base of the steps, patient and unmoving, waiting with a stillness that felt less like pressure and more like genuine, careful curiosity. "You don't have to say anything else if you're overwhelmed," he said quietly, pitched just for her despite the noise surrounding them. "I understand this must feel strange. I imagine it feels strange for both of us, honestly." "I don't understand what you smelled," Sage managed finally, her voice unsteady. "I'm not Alpha King, I promise you. Whatever you're expecting, I'm not it. I'm ordinary, genuinely, completely ordinary." "I don't experience the world in ways that make ordinary a meaningful category," Cassian said, something almost wry entering his tone, despite the gravity of the moment. "I lost my sight 3 years ago. Since then, scent has become the truest thing I know about a person. Truer than status, truer than rank, truer than whatever version of themselves people present when they know they're being watched." He tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something beneath her words. "Your scent isn't loud, Sage Calloway. It's not trying to announce itself the way some wolves' scents do, layered with perfume and performance. It's quiet and steady, and underneath it, there's something I haven't encountered in longer than I can remember. Something that made every other scent in this entire gathering fade into background noise the moment you stepped onto that platform." Ashgrove's own alpha, a broad, self-important man named Silas Gray, pushed forward through the crowd, with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and barely restrained offense. "Alpha King, surely there's been some mistake. If you're seeking a match from Ashgrove's ceremony, I'd be honored to introduce you to wolves far more suited to—" "I'm not interested in your recommendations, Alpha Gray," Cassian said, without an ounce of the deference most wolves instinctively offered a host pack's leader. "I came to this ceremony expecting nothing in particular. I'm leaving it having found something I have no intention of walking away from, simply because your pack's hierarchy suggests she's an unlikely choice." Silas's jaw tightened, but even a territorial alpha understood better than to openly argue with the most powerful ruler in 3 territories. Of course, Alpha King. Whatever you wish. Sage descended the platform steps slowly, unable to process the sheer speed at which her entire understanding of the evening had upended itself. Cassian remained where he stood, and as she reached the bottom step, he extended one hand toward her, not grasping, not commanding, simply offered, patient enough to wait for her to decide whether she wanted to take it. "You don't have to accept anything tonight," he said quietly, for her ears alone now, the surrounding crowd's noise fading into something distant and unimportant. "I understand this is sudden, and strange, and probably terrifying, given everything I've just upended by walking over here. I'm not asking you to bond with me on the spot, because tradition says an alpha's interest should be accepted without question. I'm asking you to talk with me, privately, if you're willing. Give me a chance to explain what I actually experienced the moment you stepped onto that platform, and let you decide from there whether any of it interests you at all." Sage looked at his outstretched hand, at storm cloud eyes that saw nothing, and yet had somehow found her more completely than any sighted gaze ever had in 19 years of ceremonies, exactly like this one. "Okay," she said finally, placing her hand in his. "I'll talk with you." Cassian's fingers closed gently around hers, and something in his expression eased, tension she hadn't noticed dropping from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, quiet and genuine, "for not running. I half expected you to." "I thought about it," Sage admitted honestly. "I'm glad you didn't," Cassian said, and led her carefully away from the still whispering crowd, toward a quieter corner of the ceremony grounds, where they could speak without an audience hanging on every word, leaving behind a gathering of stunned wolves who would spend the rest of the night trying, and failing, to understand exactly what they'd just witnessed. They sat together on a low stone bench at the edge of the ceremony grounds, far enough from the crowd that their conversation could unfold without an audience, close enough that Sage could still hear the distant music and laughter of a celebration continuing without her, exactly the way every choosing ceremony always had before tonight. "I want to explain properly," Cassian said, his voice steady, despite what Sage was beginning to recognize as genuine, careful vulnerability underneath it, "because I understand how strange it must have looked. An Alpha King crossing an entire ceremony grounds because of a smell nobody else could name." "I'd appreciate that," Sage said honestly. "I still don't fully understand what happened up there." Cassian was quiet for a moment, considering. "When I lost my sight," he said finally, "I lost more than the ability to see color, or faces, or the shape of a room. I lost the entire framework most wolves use to sort the world. Who looks powerful? Who looks beautiful? Who looks like they belong at the center of a room, rather than its edges? For the first year, I mourned that loss bitterly. I thought I'd been robbed of the ability to properly judge the world around me." His jaw tightened slightly. "It took me nearly 2 years to understand I hadn't lost that ability at all. I'd only lost the version of it that lies." "Scent doesn't lie the way sight does?" Sage asked, genuinely curious, despite the strangeness of the entire evening. "Scent can't perform," Cassian said. "A wolf can dress herself in silk and stand very straight and command a room's attention through nothing but presentation, and sighted wolves will read all of that as significance, as worth. But scent tells the truth underneath the performance. It carries stress, and grief, and joy, and courage, exactly as they are, with no room to disguise any of it." He turned his face slightly toward her, storm cloud eyes steady, even without sight behind them. "Every wolf at that ceremony tonight had a scent, shaped, at least partly, by performance. Nervous excitement dressed up as confidence. Ambition dressed up as warmth. Yours wasn't like that at all. Yours was the only scent in that entire gathering that felt completely, unguardedly honest." Sage's throat tightened, unexpected emotion rising at words that landed somewhere she hadn't realized still ached after years of careful, practiced invisibility. "I don't perform because no one's ever cared enough to watch," she admitted quietly. "It's not virtue, Alpha King. It's just, there's no point pretending to be interesting when you've spent 19 years learning that nobody's paying attention regardless. Something in Cassian's expression shifted, a flicker of something that looked, disconcertingly, like anger. Not at her, she realized, but on her behalf. That should never have been your reality, he said, low and fierce. A pack that teaches a wolf her whole worth doesn't merit attention has failed her completely, whatever her rank happens to be. You say that like you understand it personally, Sage said, watching him carefully. Cassian's jaw tightened. I understand what it feels like to become invisible in a different way, he said. After I lost my sight, half my own council started speaking to my advisors instead of directly to me, as though blindness had somehow made me less capable of hearing them properly. It took nearly a year of deliberate, exhausting effort to remind my own territory that losing my eyes hadn't cost me my judgment, or my strength, or my right to be spoken to directly rather than around. His voice softened. So no, I don't fully understand what 19 years of being overlooked feels like. But I understand something adjacent to it well enough to recognize, immediately, exactly what I was smelling underneath your silence tonight. Not weakness, patience, a kind of quiet, steady strength most wolves never develop, because most wolves never need to. Sage sat with that for a long moment, feeling something long buried and cautiously hopeful stir in her chest. The strange, unfamiliar sensation of being understood by someone who'd only just met her. What happens now? She asked finally. Realistically, you're an Alpha King. I'm an Omega from a minor pack, with barely any standing at all. Whatever you smelled tonight, it doesn't erase how impossible this actually is. I'm not interested in what's impossible, Cassian said. I'm interested in what's true. And what's true is that in 3 years of attending choosing ceremonies out of obligation and leaving every single one unmoved, tonight is the first time I've ever crossed a room because I couldn't make myself stay seated. He reached out, careful and slow, until his fingers found her hand resting on the bench between them, an unspoken request for permission rather than a claim. I'd like the chance to know you properly, Sage Calloway. Not tonight, not rushed, not because tradition demands it. Just the chance. Whatever comes of it after that is entirely yours to decide. Sage looked at his outstretched hand, at a king who'd found her not through the eyes that had overlooked her for 19 years, but through something far harder to fake, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the cautious, terrifying beginning of hope. I'd like that too, she said quietly, and let her fingers curl around his. Cassian's territory, Duskwood, sat 2 days' ride from Ashgrove, and Sage spent most of the journey staring out the carriage window at unfamiliar landscape, trying to reconcile the strange new shape her life had taken in the space of a single evening. You've gone quiet, Cassian observed, seated across from her, his cane resting against the seat beside him, though Sage had already noticed he rarely needed it inside familiar spaces, navigating instead through some combination of memory and the acute, careful attention he paid to sound and scent and air currents that most sighted wolves never bothered to notice at all. I keep waiting for this to stop making sense, Sage admitted. Every hour that passes without you changing your mind feels like it should be the hour it finally happens. It won't, Cassian said, simple and certain. I understand why you'd expect it to, given what you've told me about Ashgrove. But I don't operate the way most alphas do, Sage. I don't choose based on a first impression I might reconsider once the excitement fades. I chose based on something I can't unsmell, unlearn, or talk myself out of, however inconvenient the timing might be. A faint, wry smile touched his mouth. Believe me, plenty of my own counsel will spend the coming weeks trying very hard to talk me out of it regardless. That's reassuring, Sage said dryly, though something in her chest eased slightly at his certainty. Duskwood's main hall, when they finally arrived, was nothing like the modest gathering spaces Sage had known in Ashgrove, vast and stone-built, warm with firelight, staffed by wolves who moved with the particular, practiced efficiency of a territory accustomed to accommodating a leader who couldn't rely on sight to navigate it. Alpha King greeted a sharp-eyed beta woman who met them at the entrance, her gaze cutting immediately, curiously, towards Sage. Word arrived ahead of you. I understand congratulations may be in order. Premature congratulations, Cassian corrected, though warmth colored his voice as he made the introduction. Sage, this is Marisol, my second and the closest thing to family I have left in this hall. Marisol, this is Sage Calloway. Marisol's assessing gaze lingered on Sage a moment longer than was entirely comfortable, though there was nothing unkind in it, only the careful, protective scrutiny of someone who clearly took her king's well-being seriously. You're the wolf who made him cross an entire ceremony ground mid-song, she said finally. That's not a small thing. In 3 years of watching him decline every match his advisors have paraded in front of him. I still don't fully understand what he smelled, Sage admitted. None of us do. Entirely, Marisol said, something almost fond entering her tone now. But I've watched Cassian navigate this hall through scent and sound alone for 3 years, and I've never once seen his judgment fail him. If he says there's something worth finding in you, I'd trust that a great deal more than I'd trust most sighted alphas' first impressions. The following days passed in a strange, careful rhythm Sage had never experienced before. Meals taken together where Cassian asked genuine, patient questions about her life in Ashgrove. Walks through Duskwood's grounds where he described the territory to her not through sight, since he had none to offer, but through the sounds and scents that mapped it in his own mind, the particular birdsong near the eastern garden, the way the air changed near the training yards, details Sage suspected most sighted wolves never bothered noticing at all. You pay attention to everything, she observed one afternoon, walking beside him through Duskwood's herb garden, close enough that her shoulder occasionally brushed his. I have to, Cassian said. Attention is the only substitute I have for sight. But I've come to think it's not really a lesser substitute at all, just a different way of understanding the same world. He paused, turning his face toward her with the careful attentiveness she was beginning to recognize as entirely his own. You do the same thing, I've noticed. You've spent our entire walk cataloging which plants I'm avoiding versus which ones I deliberately reach toward, adjusting your descriptions accordingly without me ever asking you to. Sage flushed, caught. I didn't realize I was doing that. That's precisely why it matters, Cassian said, something warm entering his voice. You're not performing attentiveness for my benefit. You're simply, naturally attentive, the same quiet, steady quality I smelled the moment you stepped onto that platform. He reached out, finding her hand with unerring accuracy despite his blindness, and Sage let him take it, feeling the same slow, unfamiliar warmth she'd felt every day since Ashgrove's choosing ceremony. I meant what I said that first night, Sage. I want to know you properly. Not because tradition demands it, and not because my council keeps insisting an alpha king needs a mate for stability's sake. Because every day I spend with you, I understand a little more clearly exactly what I smelled that first night, and I like what I'm finding. Sage looked at him, at a king who'd found her through honesty rather than performance, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, the beginning of a certainty she'd never once let herself hope for. She had no idea yet how quickly that certainty would be tested. The summons to Duskwood's council chamber arrived on the 10th morning of Sage's stay, delivered by Marisol with an expression that told Sage, before a single word was spoken, exactly how difficult the coming conversation was going to be. They want to meet you, Marisol said, formally, and I won't pretend the mood in that chamber is entirely welcoming. They think he's making a mistake, Sage said, not a question. They think he's making a decision based on something they don't understand and can't verify, Marisol corrected, not unkindly. Cassian's council respects him enormously, Sage, but respect doesn't stop half of them from believing his blindness sometimes makes him vulnerable to choices a sighted alpha wouldn't make. It's an old worry, and an unfair one, but it's real, and you're about to walk directly into it. The council chamber, when Sage entered beside Cassian an hour later, held 9 advisors seated around a long stone table, their expressions ranging from careful neutrality to open, barely disguised skepticism. At the head of the group sat an older wolf, with silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes, introduced simply as Elder Thorn, Duskwood's longest-serving advisor, and, Sage quickly understood, the chamber's most vocal doubter. "Alpha King," Thorn began, once the formalities had concluded, "we understand the choosing ceremony moved you deeply. We don't question your right to pursue whatever match you believe suits you best. But surely you understand the concern this decision has raised throughout the council." "Say it plainly, Thorn," Cassian said, unbothered. "You've never once dressed up an objection in diplomatic language before. I don't expect you to start now." Thorn's mouth twitched, something almost like respect flickering across his weathered features, despite the tension in the room. "Very well. You chose an unranked Omega from a minor pack, based entirely on scent, in front of an entire gathering, with no negotiation, no formal courtship, no opportunity for this council to properly assess whether the match serves Duskwood's interests. Some of us worry, Alpha King, that your blindness has left you relying too heavily on instinct in matters that traditionally require more careful, deliberate consideration." The room went very still. Sage felt her pulse quicken, old, familiar shame rising automatically at being discussed as a liability rather than a person, but she made herself stay steady, refusing to shrink the way 19 years of practiced invisibility urged her to. "My blindness," Cassian said, voice deceptively calm, "has taught me to trust instinct more precisely than sight ever did, Elder Thorn. Not less. Sight can be fooled by presentation. Scent cannot. I've spent 3 years learning exactly how much truth lives beneath a performance, and I've never once been wrong about a wolf's character. Once I understood what I was actually sensing." His jaw tightened. "I understand this council's caution. I even respect it, in principle. But I won't have Sage discussed in this chamber as though she's a political liability rather than the wolf whose honesty I've spent 10 days coming to know and admire. If you have concerns about her character specifically, ask her directly. She's sitting right here, and she's entirely capable of answering for herself." Sage's breath caught at the fierce, unhesitating defense, something warm blooming in her chest, despite the tension of the room. Thorn studied her for a long moment, his sharp gaze assessing in a way that reminded Sage uncomfortably of every dismissive glance she'd received her entire life. "Very well," he said finally. "Tell me, Sage Calloway, what qualifies you to stand beside an Alpha King? What have you accomplished? What skills do you bring? What makes you a match worth this council's trust?" Sage felt the old, familiar instinct to shrink, to apologize for her own unremarkable existence, the way she always had at Ashgrove. But something about the last 10 days, Cassian's patient attention, his fierce defense, the strange, unfamiliar experience of being genuinely seen, steadied her instead. "Nothing you'd recognize as an accomplishment, Elder Thorn," she said honestly. "I've never held rank, or led a hunt, or negotiated a treaty. I've spent 19 years being exactly as overlooked as you clearly expect me to be." She held his gaze, refusing to look away. "But I've also spent 19 years learning to survive, being consistently dismissed, without ever once becoming cruel or bitter about it. I've learned patience most wolves never have to develop, because most wolves never have to. I don't perform confidence I don't feel, and I don't dress up my worth to make it more palatable to a room that's already decided I don't belong in it." Her voice steadied further. "You're welcome to doubt whether that's enough for a council table, Elder Thorn. But I'd ask you to consider that your Alpha King, who has spent 3 years learning to hear truth other wolves can't, chose to cross an entire ceremony ground the moment he encountered it in me. That should carry at least as much weight as whatever formal accomplishments you're used to measuring." The chamber fell silent, several council members exchanging surprised, reconsidering glances. Thorn studied her for a long, weighing moment, then, slowly, inclined his head. "That," he said finally, "was a more honest answer than I expected, and a more compelling one than most political matches this council has ever vetted. He looked toward Cassian. I withdraw my formal objection, Alpha King. Though I'll admit, I remain curious to see how this unfolds. Cassian's hand found Sage's beneath the table, warm and steady, and Sage felt, for the first time since entering the chamber, the tension in her shoulders finally begin to ease. She had won the council's cautious approval. She had no idea yet that the true threat to her happiness was still traveling toward Duskwood's gates. The messenger arrived 3 weeks later, exhausted and travel-worn, carrying a sealed letter bearing Ashgrove's crest, and Sage felt her stomach drop the moment Marisol brought it to her, rather than directly to Cassian. "It's addressed to you," Marisol said, handing over the letter with a wary expression. "From Alpha Silas Grey." Sage broke the seal with unsteady hands, and the words inside settled over her like the return of a cold she'd almost, finally, managed to forget. "Sage, word has reached Ashgrove of your continued presence in Duskwood territory, and of rumors that Alpha King Cassian Vale intends to formalize a mating bond with you. As your pack Alpha, I feel obligated to remind you that any such bond requires your home pack's formal consent under Northern Territory law, consent which Ashgrove has not yet granted, and, I must be honest, has significant reservations about extending. I am traveling to Duskwood personally to discuss this matter, and to ensure that whatever decision is ultimately reached properly accounts for Ashgrove's interests as your home territory. I trust Alpha King Vale will understand the importance of proper procedure in a matter of this significance." Alpha Silas Grey. Sage read it twice, feeling old, familiar dread pool low in her stomach. "He's coming here," she said, showing Cassian the letter, though of course he couldn't read it himself, his fingers instead finding hers to feel the tension radiating off her. "Silas Grey, he says Ashgrove hasn't granted consent for our bond." Cassian's jaw tightened, something dangerous entering his expression. "What kind of consent does that actually require, legally?" "Technically," Marisol said, having listened to the letter's contents over Sage's shoulder, "Northern Territory law does require a home pack's formal blessing for a mating bond between an unranked Omega and an Alpha of significantly higher status. It's meant to prevent exploitation, ensuring lower-ranked wolves aren't coerced into bonds they don't genuinely want." Her expression darkened. "But it's also historically been used exactly the opposite way. Home packs withholding consent specifically to extract concessions from the more powerful Alpha involved." "That's what this is," Sage said quietly, understanding settling over her with sick clarity. "Silas never cared about my well-being at that ceremony, Marisol. He barely knew my name before Alpha King Vale crossed that platform. He's coming here because Ashgrove suddenly understands I might be valuable as leverage, not because he's genuinely concerned about proper procedure." Cassian's hand tightened around hers, fury barely restrained beneath his controlled exterior. "Then we make certain he understands exactly how little leverage he actually holds." Silas Grey arrived at Duskwood's gate 4 days later, and Sage stood beside Cassian in the Great Hall as their unwelcome visitor was announced, feeling old instincts toward invisibility warring against 3 weeks of learning. Slowly, what it felt like to be genuinely valued instead. "Alpha King Vale," Silas began, all smooth, practiced diplomacy. "I appreciate you receiving me so promptly. I understand my letter may have arrived somewhat abruptly, but surely you understand Ashgrove's position. Sage has been a member of this pack her entire life. We have both rights and responsibilities regarding her future that can't simply be set aside because of a sudden attraction at a choosing ceremony." "Her entire life," Cassian repeated, voice deceptively even, during which, by Sage's own account, Ashgrove treated her as invisible at best and irrelevant at worst. "I'm curious, Alpha Grey, exactly what responsibility you believe your pack has demonstrated toward her over 19 years, given that account." Silas's composure flickered. "Pack hierarchy naturally results in some wolves receiving less individual attention than others, Alpha King. That's simply the nature of a large territory. It doesn't mean Ashgrove abandoned its obligations. It means precisely that, Cassian said, fury entering his voice now, controlled but unmistakable. You're standing in my hall, arguing that a pack, which never once made her feel valued, somehow retains the right to determine her future, now that her value has become obvious to someone else. What exactly do you actually want, Alpha Grey? Let's dispense with the procedural language and discuss the truth of this visit plainly. Silas's jaw tightened, calculation flickering behind his eyes as he abandoned pretense. A formal alliance between Ashgrove and Duskwood, sealed through appropriate trade agreements, would go a long way toward securing my pack's blessing for this bond. Surely that's not an unreasonable request, given the significant honor Sage's elevation represents for Ashgrove's reputation. Sage felt something in her chest go cold, and then, immediately after, fiercely, unexpectedly resolved. 19 years of being overlooked had taught her exactly what it felt like to be treated as worthless. She wasn't about to stand silently while she was treated as a bargaining chip instead. I have a response to that request myself, Alpha Grey, Sage said, stepping forward before Cassian could answer on her behalf. If you're willing to hear it directly from the wolf you're actually discussing. Silas Grey's eyebrows rose, visible surprise crossing his features at being directly addressed by the wolf he'd traveled 3 days specifically to negotiate leverage over. Of course, he said, recovering his composure with visible effort. I'd welcome your perspective, Sage. You didn't come here for my perspective, Sage said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. 19 years of practiced silence finally, deliberately breaking. You came here because Ashgrove suddenly understands I might be worth something, and you're determined to extract every advantage from that discovery, before you'll grant a consent that should never have been yours to withhold in the first place. She held his gaze, refusing to let old instincts toward smallness win out now, when it mattered most. I spent 19 years in your territory, Alpha Grey. In 19 years, you spoke to me exactly 4 times and never once about anything beyond routine pack administration. You didn't know my name at the ceremony until Alpha King Vale said it aloud. You have no genuine investment in my well-being, and I refuse to let you pretend otherwise, simply because pretending happens to be profitable now. Sage, Silas began, something placating entering his tone. I understand you're upset, but surely you can see this isn't personal. It's entirely personal. Sage cut him off, something fierce and unfamiliar rising in her chest, an anger she'd never once let herself express in 19 years of careful invisibility. You're attempting to use my future as a negotiating tool for trade agreements that will benefit Ashgrove's council, and do absolutely nothing for me. That's about as personal as it gets, Alpha Grey, given that it's my life you're bargaining with. Cassian's hand found the small of her back, steady and supportive rather than possessive, and Sage felt a fresh surge of courage from the simple, wordless reassurance that she wasn't facing this alone. There's also, Cassian added, his voice deceptively calm despite the fury Sage could feel radiating off him, the matter of Northern Territory law's actual purpose here, which you've conveniently overlooked in your letter, Alpha Grey. The consent requirement exists to protect lower-ranked wolves from coercion. It was never intended to grant a home pack leverage over a match the wolf herself genuinely desires. I'd be very interested to hear you explain to the full Council of Northern Alphas exactly how withholding consent, specifically to extract trade concessions, serves that original protective purpose. Silas paled slightly, understanding the threat beneath the calm words. That's not, Alpha King. Surely we can resolve this without escalating to the full council. We can resolve it very simply, Sage said, drawing herself up to her full height, feeling something settle into place inside her that had never quite existed before this moment. I choose Alpha King Cassian Vale. Freely, without coercion, without hesitation, and entirely without needing Ashgrove's permission to do so. If your council genuinely believes it holds legitimate authority to block that choice for reasons having nothing to do with my actual well-being, I invite you to bring that argument in front of the full council of Northern Alphas yourself, Alpha Grey, and explain in detail exactly why a pack that ignored me for 19 years suddenly believes it has the right to determine my future now. The hall fell silent, Silas Grey's composure cracking fully now, calculation giving way to the dawning understanding that he'd badly misjudged both the woman standing before him and the king beside her. He began, then stopped, visibly reconsidering his entire approach. Perhaps, he said finally, more carefully, there's room for a simpler resolution here. Perhaps Ashgrove's consent needn't be tied to any formal trade agreement at all. Perhaps, Cassian said, cold and unyielding, you should have arrived at that conclusion before attempting to extort concessions from a bond that was never legitimately yours to withhold consent for in the first place. Silas swallowed, glancing between them, clearly recognizing that whatever leverage he'd believed he held had evaporated entirely in the face of Sage's unflinching resolve and Cassian's unwavering support. I'll grant formal consent, he said finally, something almost like defeat entering his voice. Freely, without conditions. I apologize, Sage, if my approach here suggested otherwise. It didn't suggest it, Sage said, unwilling to let him soften what had actually happened. It stated it plainly, but I accept the consent regardless, since it changes nothing about the choice I've already made. Silas departed within the hour, and Sage stood in Duskwood's great hall long after his carriage had disappeared down the mountain road, feeling something enormous and unfamiliar settle over her, the strange, powerful sensation of having finally, completely, refused to be small. You were extraordinary, Cassian said quietly, turning to face her, storm-cloud eyes steady, despite their blindness, finding her with the same unerring accuracy he always managed. I've watched you grow more certain of yourself every single day, since that choosing ceremony, Sage. But today, I think, is the first day I watched you fully believe it. I think you're right, Sage admitted, something warm and steady blooming in her chest. 19 years, and it took someone finally seeing me, really seeing me, even without eyes at all, before I could see myself the same way. The weeks following Silas Grey's departure passed in a warm, steady rhythm that Sage had never once believed herself capable of experiencing. Mornings spent walking Duskwood's grounds with Cassian. Afternoons learning the territory's history from Marisol. Evenings spent simply existing beside a man who valued her presence without ever once asking her to shrink to make room for it. You're different than you were a month ago, Marisol observed one afternoon, watching Sage direct a small group of pack members reorganizing Duskwood's herb stores with a confidence that would have been unimaginable to the woman who'd arrived so uncertain and quiet 3 weeks earlier. I feel different, Sage admitted, setting down a basket of dried lavender. I don't know exactly when it happened. I think it happened slowly. Every day Cassian asked what I actually thought about something instead of assuming he already knew. Every day, nobody in this hall looked through me like I wasn't standing there. He asks my opinion on nearly everything too, Marisol said, something fond entering her expression. It's not just you, though I suspect what he feels for you runs considerably deeper than professional respect. It's simply how he leads. Losing his sight taught him that assumption is the enemy of good judgment. He'd rather ask a direct question and actually listen to the answer than assume he already understands a situation because of how it appears on the surface. That evening, Sage found Cassian alone, in Duskwood's private garden, seated on the same stone bench where they'd first talked properly, weeks ago now, his face tilted toward the sound of wind moving through the herb beds. You found me, he said, without turning, recognizing her scent and footsteps before she'd even spoken. I was hoping you would. You could have sent for me, Sage said, settling onto the bench beside him. I could have, Cassian agreed. But I've come to enjoy being found, rather than always doing the finding. It's a strange kind of trust, letting someone locate you in the dark, rather than always announcing exactly where you are. He turned toward her, something serious entering his expression. "I've been thinking, since Silas Gray's visit, about what you said to him. About 19 years of being overlooked, and how it took someone finally seeing you to change that." His jaw tightened slightly. "I want to be honest with you about something, Sage, because I think you deserve complete honesty from me. Always." "What is it?" Sage asked, a flicker of uncertainty rising despite the warmth of the past weeks. "I've spent this entire month terrified," Cassian admitted, "that eventually you'd realize the version of yourself you've discovered here. Confident, unafraid, willing to stand up to an alpha twice your former pack's size. Might have happened regardless of me. That I'd simply been fortunate enough to be standing nearby when you finally found it, rather than genuinely responsible for helping you find it at all." His voice roughened. "I don't need credit for your growth, Sage. I want to be clear about that. But I do need you to understand that whatever I felt that first night at Ashgrove's ceremony, it's only deepened every single day since, watching you become more completely yourself. I'm not in love with a version of you I imagined that first evening. I'm in love with exactly who you've continued proving yourself to be every day since." Sage's breath caught. The word, love, settling over her with a weight she hadn't fully anticipated, despite weeks of growing certainty. "You love me," she repeated softly. "Completely," Cassian said, no hesitation at all in his voice. "I knew something the moment I smelled you at that ceremony. Something honest and rare that made every other scent in that entire gathering fade into meaningless background noise. But scent alone doesn't create love, Sage. It only opened the door. Everything I've learned about you since, your patience, your courage, the way you refused to shrink in front of Silas Gray when 19 years of instinct told you to, that's what walked through that door and stayed." His hand found hers, steady and certain. "I love you. Not the idea of you, not the scent that first drew me across a crowded ceremony ground, but the entire, complicated, remarkable woman I've spent a month coming to know completely." Sage felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. 19 years of believing herself unworthy of exactly this kind of certainty, finally, gently giving way. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and impossibly true. "I think I have for weeks now. I just didn't trust myself to believe it could actually be real." Cassian's expression transformed, careful composure breaking open into something unguarded and warm, and when he leaned in to kiss her, gentle enough to stop the moment she wanted him to, Sage felt every last uncertain doubt she'd carried since Ashgrove's ceremony finally, completely dissolve. She had no idea that within days, her newfound certainty would be tested one final time. The letter arrived without warning, on a grey morning, delivered not by messenger, but by an anonymous hand, left tucked beneath Sage's door sometime in the night, and its contents sent her entire fragile new confidence, crashing back toward the old, familiar doubt she'd spent a month learning to unlearn. "Sage, you should know the truth before you commit yourself fully to a bond built on false premises. Alpha King Vale's advisors have been quietly discussing, for weeks now, the political advantages your bond provides. Specifically, the way an unranked, unconnected Omega mate presents no threat to existing power structures within his council, unlike a higher-ranked match might. Ask yourself honestly whether his interest is truly about you, or about the convenient political stability an Omega with no Jadzu influence provides an Alpha King still working to secure his rule after his blindness. A friend who wishes you clarity before it's too late." Sage read it 3 times, feeling 19 years of learned insecurity rise up all at once. Old wounds she'd believed healing tearing open, with startling ease. She thought of Elder Thorne's initial skepticism, of Marisol's admission that some council members worried about Cassian's judgment. She thought of every year at Ashgrove when she'd assumed the worst about her own worth and been proven right, again and again, until doubting herself had become the only reliable prediction she'd ever made. What if it's true? The thought coiled through her chest like poison. What if scent isn't as honest as he believes it to be? What if I've simply been convenient, easy, unlikely to challenge him the way a more powerful match might? She spent the entire morning avoiding Cassian, unable to trust her own voice not to betray the sudden, crushing return of every insecurity she'd believed herself finally free of. And by afternoon, Marisol found her hiding in the herb garden, uncharacteristically still, the letter crumpled in her fist. "What happened?" Marisol asked, settling beside her with careful concern. Sage handed over the letter without a word, watching Marisol's expression darken as she read it. "This is cowardly and cruel," Marisol said finally, fury coloring her voice. "Whoever wrote this knew exactly which doubts to aim at. Sage, that's not clarity. That's a deliberate attempt to poison something good, because someone, somewhere, doesn't benefit from you and Cassian staying together." "But what if it's not entirely wrong?" Sage asked, voice cracking. "What if some part of his council genuinely does see me as convenient, exactly because I have no influence to threaten anyone's position?" "Then that would say something about certain council members' priorities," Marisol said firmly, "and nothing whatsoever about Cassian's actual feelings for you, which I have watched deepen daily for an entire month with my own eyes. Sage, in ways no political calculation could ever fake." She took Sage's hands, forcing her to meet her gaze. "You told Silas Gray that scent doesn't lie. Do you actually believe that, or were those simply convenient words for winning an argument?" "I believe it," Sage admitted quietly. "Then trust it now," Marisol said. "Go to Cassian, show him this letter. Whatever fear it's trying to plant, the only way through it is honesty, not silence. 19 years of silence taught you nothing but how to disappear. Sage, don't let one anonymous coward undo a month of learning something braver." Sage found Cassian in his study an hour later, and the moment she handed him the letter, reading it aloud since he couldn't see the words himself, his expression darkened into something fierce and immediate. "This is deliberate cruelty," he said, once she'd finished, "aimed precisely at insecurities someone clearly understood you'd carry from Ashgrove. I don't know who wrote it, but I intend to find out." He reached for her hands, holding them steady despite the tremor still running through her own. "Sage, listen to me carefully. I have never once discussed your lack of political connections as an advantage. Not with my council, not with Marisol, not in the privacy of my own thoughts. If certain advisors have quietly celebrated that particular convenience, that reflects their own priorities, not mine, and I promise you I will address it directly and forcefully." "How do I know that's true?" Sage asked, hating the vulnerability in her own voice, hating that 19 years of doubt could still rise this fast, this completely. "You know it," Cassian said gently, "the same way I knew something the moment I smelled you at that ceremony. Not through words alone, which can always be doubted, but through everything underneath them. I've spent a month showing you, every single day, exactly what you mean to me. I can't undo one anonymous letter's damage with words if you've stopped trusting the truth beneath them." His voice roughened. "But I'm asking you to trust it anyway. Not because I'm demanding it, because I think, somewhere underneath the fear this letter reawakened, you already do." Sage looked at him, at storm-cloud eyes that had found her through nothing but honest scent when the entire sighted world had overlooked her for 19 years, and felt the poison of the anonymous letter slowly, deliberately begin to lose its grip. "I trust it," she said finally, quiet but certain. "I trust you. I think I just needed to say the fear out loud instead of letting it fester in silence." "Always say it out loud," Cassian said, pulling her close. "Whatever it is, I would rather face 100 difficult conversations with you than watch you disappear back into 19 years of silence because you were afraid to trust what we've built." The council chamber, 3 days later, held a very different atmosphere than the tense gathering that had greeted Sage a month earlier. This time filled not with skepticism, but with the quiet, gathering excitement of witnesses assembled for a bonding ceremony rather than an interrogation. Cassian had spent the intervening days tracing the anonymous letter to its source, a minor advisor named Percival, ambitious enough to believe an unranked mate might eventually be pressured into ceding influence he coveted for himself, cowardly enough to attempt undermining her rather than confront his own resentments directly. Percival had been formally dismissed from Duskwood's council within a day of the truth surfacing, and Cassian had made certain, in front of the entire assembled council, that no wolf in his hall would ever again mistake Sage's lack of political connections for a lack of genuine worth. Now Sage stood at the center of that same chamber, dressed in deep midnight blue robes that Marisol had helped select, feeling nothing like the uncertain, overlooked girl who'd once stood frozen at Ashgrove's choosing ceremony, waiting for a rejection she'd believed inevitable. "Nervous?" Marisol asked, adjusting the fall of Sage's sleeve with careful, affectionate precision. "Less than I expected to be," Sage admitted. "I think I finally believe this is real." "It's been real since the moment he crossed that ceremony ground," Marisol said. "The rest of us just needed time to catch up to what he already understood." Cassian appeared at the chamber's entrance, dressed in formal Duskwood colors, and though his storm-cloud eyes couldn't see the transformation the past month had wrought in her, Sage watched him breathe in deeply the moment she entered his awareness, an unmistakable smile spreading across his features. "There you are," he said, warmth filling every syllable. "I'd know you anywhere, Sage, in any room, in any darkness. I hope you understand by now exactly how completely true that is." "I do," Sage said, crossing the chamber to take his offered hands, steady now, in a way that had nothing to do with performance, and everything to do with a month spent learning, slowly and completely, that she was worth exactly the attention he'd given her from the very first night. Elder Thorne, who had traveled from skepticism to genuine advocacy over the preceding weeks, stepped forward to officiate, his weathered voice carrying easily through the hushed chamber. "We gather today," he said, "to witness a bond unlike any this council has formalized in living memory, not born of rank or negotiation or political convenience, but of a truth our Alpha King found through means the rest of us too often overlook entirely." His sharp eyes softened slightly as he looked between them. "Sage Calloway, do you choose Alpha King Cassian Vale freely, understanding everything this bond will ask of you?" "I do," Sage said, her voice steady and certain. "Completely, and without a single doubt remaining." "Alpha King Cassian Vale," Thorne continued, "do you choose Sage Calloway, understanding that this council, and the wolves who will follow her lead, deserve a leader worthy of genuine trust and respect?" "I chose her the moment I smelled the truth beneath 19 years of learned silence," Cassian said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed chamber. "Every day since has only confirmed exactly how right that first instinct was." The formal words of bonding passed between them, ancient and binding, and when Cassian finally kissed her in front of the assembled council, the same wolves who had once questioned whether an unranked Omega belonged in this hall at all, the chamber erupted into howls of celebration that Sage felt in her chest more than heard, a sound built entirely out of a territory that had watched her transform, slowly and completely, from invisible to essential. "I love you," Cassian murmured against her hair, quiet enough that it belonged only to her, even surrounded by the celebrating crowd. "Not for the scent that first drew me across that ceremony ground, though I'll always be grateful for it, for everything you've proven yourself to be every single day since." "I love you too," Sage said, feeling the truth of it settle into every corner of a life she'd once believed would always exist at the margins, overlooked and unremarkable. "I spent 19 years believing sight was the only way anyone could ever truly see me. You taught me it was never the sight that mattered at all." Outside the chamber's tall windows, evening settled gently over Duskwood territory, and somewhere in that gathering dusk, a girl who had once stood invisible at the edge of every ceremony, finally, completely understood what it meant to be found, not by eyes that had always looked straight through her, but by something rarer and truer and infinitely harder to fake. That's the end of today's story, but maybe it's only the beginning. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let me know in the comments how you think the story continued. Thanks for being here.